Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this session, I would like to share with you some of my own personal experiences from years ago that I felt were really interesting in attack, in tactics, and decision making. Well, let's start with the first example. It's a game I played back in 1983, and I had the black pieces in this position. Well, let's look at the situation and what's going on. Each side has equal material as of the piece is concerned, and also the pawns for each. Now, if you look at the position, at first it seems that the black king is in a much more delicate position because black is missing the f and g pawns already. In addition, the white queen on g4 is looking straight at the black king, pinning the black bishop on g7. White has an ideally positioned knight on e4, a dangerous looking pawn on f5 that's about to advance to f6, attacking the bishop and use the pin. And in addition, the white bishop is about to capture the pawn on h6. So at this first glance, it seems that white has a serious advantage in this position. However, if we take a deeper look, we'll see that the evaluation will be different. What we need to look at on the other side of the coin is that white has a rook on a1 that is right now on an unprotected square. While it's true that usually that's not a terribly important thing because, well, that's just exactly where the rook starts the game, and it didn't yet have time to get developed and get out of there. However, in view of the b2 pawn already being gone, it gives a potential opportunity for black to possibly give a fork. If you can imagine the black queen right now capturing his own knight on d4, that would be immediately a check and a fork, winning the rook in the corner. Obviously, black cannot do that by the rules of the game. However, black may find a way to move that knight away and combine that with the threat of the queen d4 check. Well, now we need to calculate. It's one of those situations when making the normal logical move, like for example moving the king out of the pin, out of the g file, moving it to h8 or h7, wouldn't be sufficient because it would give white the time to develop the bishop on c1 and connect the rooks. And then after that, the issue of the rook on a1 being unprotected would no longer exist. So all white would need is just to get that bishop out of there, even if it's not capturing the pawn on h6, but just develop it to a3, for example, would give white the opportunity to complete development and maintain the strategical advantage they already have. However, fortunately in my case, it was my move, and my opponent was the international master Hausner, and I had the opportunity to find a nice combination. I suggest before you listen further, you try to figure out what move I made right now for black. And that move was knight captures f5. The basic idea of this combination is that if now rook captures the knight on f5, then black gets the chance to play queen d4 check and capture the rook in the corner on a1. Therefore, my opponent, understanding that, moved his bishop out to a3, connecting the rooks on one hand and attacking my rook on f8 on the other hand, and potentially also the knight, of course, on f5 may be hanging. I found the best option here, and that was not to move my rook right away from the attack, but make an intermediate check, queen d4. King moved out of the check, king h1, and now the question is how to continue. The rook is still hanging on f8, and white would be threatening also to move his rook away from the corner from a1 to d1, attacking my queen, and then once the f1 rook is not busy guarding the rook in the corner, then that rook from f1 could capture the knight on f5 next. Luckily, I had another intermediate move at hand, playing knight e3, creating a fork on the white queen and rook. Of course, things are not quite as simple as I'd like it to be. White also has an intermediate check at hand by playing queen e6. And now, where should I move my king? The general rule of thumb is that in situations when there is one colored bishops left on the board, in this case only dark colored bishops, it's preferable to move to the opposite color square. Like in this case, if the king would move to h8, that would give a potential for white, after bishop takes on f8, maybe to check the king on g7. So therefore, the much better choice here is to move to h7, making sure no such checking possibilities will come about. Okay, let's look at the situation right now, what's going on. The white knight is under attack on e4, so is the white rook on f1. However, white may be able to capture the rook on f8, and that's exactly what my opponent did. Bishop captured on f8. And this is a critical moment. I'm able to capture the bishop on f8, the rook on f1, or the knight on e4. Capturing the rook on f1 is the least advisable because it would clear up the f5 square for the white queen to check at. It's okay to capture the knight on e4, not a bad choice, because after that the white bishop would be still under attack, so would be the white rook, and in addition black would be threatening to checkmate on g2. So it certainly looks like a good choice. I chose in the game to simply recapture, maintaining my attack on the rook on a1. So therefore, white right now cannot capture my rook on f8 because I would capture the rook on a1, and that would be a back rank checkmate within a move. At the same time, right now, the white rook is still under attack. In fact, it's under dual attack both by the rook and the knight, and so is the white knight hanging on e4. My opponent moved the rook away from the attack with the idea that when now I capture the knight on e4, which I did, he'll play queen to h3. And it seems like white is the one laughing last, because the knight on e3 is pinned, the knight is attacked twice, and I cannot protect it with any of my pieces. However, thanks to a tactical opportunity, thanks to the weakness of white's back rank, I have a saving move. And that is to play queen d4. Again, the same idea that the white rook from e1 is busy guarding the rook on a1 and therefore cannot capture the knight. On the other hand, if right now the queen would capture the knight, then I would have the deflecting combination with rook f1 and winning the queen. Let's go back again, just for one more moment. After my move queen d4, my opponent moved the rook away to c1, but now, since the knight is no longer in a pin, the knight is free to go, and it went to g4, threatening with the fork knight f2, and white is pretty helpless against and cannot avoid losing further material. Therefore, my opponent resigned. Let's move on to the next example that was played in the same year, 1983, in fact at the same tournament. In this position, I had the black pieces also, and my opponent just moved his rook to c1, attacking my queen. Well, here is the situation. My opponent offered a draw, thinking that if I move back my queen to e4, he'll have the opportunity to just keep attacking my queen, with the idea that whether immediately or right here I move my queen to b4, then he'll play queen d3 with a double attack on my rook and knight, and therefore I'll have to avoid this sequence of moves and rather just move in the initial position between c4 and e4, and then he'll keep attacking my queen, rook c1 and e1, and we'll keep repeating moves, and the game is a draw. So I would suggest you take your time and try to see what you would do other than accepting the draw offer. And here is what I did. I went queen e4, pulling the rook's hand to e1, and we shall see soon why that's important that the white rook is on e1 and not on c1. Queen b4 and queen d3. And I allowed this fork in view of my next move, advancing my e-pawn ahead. e4, sacrificed my knight, so now I can play e3. Now we can see why it was so important to lure the white rook first to e1, making sure the white bishop will not have that escape square on e1. Now white has a serious situation. The bishop is hanging, and even though it seems that the e3 pawn is pinned, it really isn't, because pawn captures bishop would be a check. If right now the bishop would try to move away to h4, then I would continue by playing f3, a real powerful move, on one hand threatening to advance the pawn further and to fork, and on the other hand opening up the fourth rank and attack the bishop on h4 all at the same time. And if you look into it, you'll find that white does not have a reasonable defense against both of those threats. But how about white instead moves the king out of the check? For example, moving the king to the corner. Now, if pawn takes bishop, then indeed the pawn would be pinned and black would lose the rook on e8. Well, obviously, I wouldn't be capturing the bishop now, but the best choice right now for black is to just connect the rooks and therefore renew the threat on the bishop. Now the bishop must remain on the e1 h4 diagonal, otherwise the rook on e1 would be lost, and on the bishop h4 move, the response will be to play bishop g5, and then the bishop is kind of trapped. Obviously, it cannot capture on g5 without losing the e1 rook, and other than that, black will just capture the bishop on h4. And finally, let's go back to see the game, how my opponent responded in this position after e3. He chose to play king f1 with the same idea, getting away from the check of the e3 pawn. However, right now, I had another pawn advance at my disposal and pushed the f-pawn to f3. Well, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to open files against my opponent king. If right now the pawn captures on f3, the rook will just capture back, and we can see how horrendous the white position will be after that. My opponent moved the bishop to g3, away from the attack, in hopes that I would advance my f-pawn, in which case white would be still okay. However, I advanced my e-pawn, and now things are really sad for white. White cannot avoid getting checkmated real soon, and therefore my opponent resigned. If my opponent would move king f2 right now, then bishop e3 checkmate arrives immediately. Or, if the king moves to g1, which looks slightly better, it only delays the end by a bit, and now black again has a beautiful combination. F2 check, bishop captures F2, and now the queen sacrifice, opening up the F file again, followed by the immediate checkmate with the rook. A beautiful final combination that unfortunately didn't play out because my opponent resigned after the E2 check. Let's see another game still from the same year, although a different tournament. This was another game I played, although this time I was with the white pieces. This is a typical situation of a hedgehog setup that my opponent chose. What is the hedgehog known for? In chess, well, it's known for black pretty much voluntarily limiting his development to the last 3 rows. As you can see, black has not crossed the 6th rank. He doesn't have a single piece on the 5th rank, while white comfortably has space advantage and has pieces along the first 4 rank. And the interesting part is that despite white's space advantage, it actually is a very reasonable opening choice for black, and black is looking out for ways at the right moment to get out of this hedgehog situation and play either d5 or b5. Those are the 2 breakout plans that black typically has. However, white at the same time tries to control extremely well, especially those 2 key squares in this pawn structure. As you can see, white right now controls the b5 square 3 times with the 2 knights and the pawn, and the d5 square with 4 pieces. The knight on c3, the 2 pawns on the 4th rank, and from the background the bishop on g2. Of course, it's important to note that despite white's majority control of that d5 square, things could be different if there is a fork or a pin or a discovery or such involved. While it's true that black could have played d5 here, and it would work excellently if right now the pawn captures on d5, the reason why black did not play d5 is because white wouldn't capture the pawn but would advance it to e5, and the black knight would have a difficult time to find a good square to go to. My opponent instead in the game continued with g6, opening up to redevelop the bishop on g7. This is a very typical plan that black often uses in the hedgehog type of positions. Even though the bishop already developed to e7, then castled, rook went to e8, and then bishop back to f8 to then relocate to g7. The drawback of this plan is that black will have more difficulty in defending the d6 pawn when the bishop is on a different diagonal. And here I made sure my queen is no longer in that potential discovery and moved it back to d2, even though here it is also in the line of black's rook, although of the other one, the one on d8. Bishop moved to g7, and now finally I hid my queen behind my rooks on e1. My opponent played knight c5, finally crossing the 6th rank, a typical place for the knight, and I retreated my knight to c2, with the idea to double up my rooks on the d file and try to put pressure on that pawn. And here my opponent made a blunder, putting the bishop on c6 on an unprotected square. And I invite you to take your time and try to figure out why this is a mistake and what should white play to take advantage of it. And that move is to play e5. All of a sudden, this is a discovered attack. The black bishop on c6 is hanging, and so is the black knight. And the point is that when black makes the exchange on g2, I'm not recapturing on g2, but making an intermediate capture on f6, and now both black's bishops are hanging. If right now black captures the pawn on h3, I would capture the bishop on g7, and then black would have difficulty recapturing that pawn, because then there is a knight discovered jump to e4 or d5 with excellent position for white. In the game itself, after pawn takes knight, my opponent continued by playing queen b7 in hopes to create a checkmate threat after bishop takes h3 or bishop h1. But I bravely captured the bishop anyway, and after bishop h3, which indeed looks pretty good for black, threatening checkmate on g2 and also a possible skewer with bishop g4, luckily I had an excellent move that at the same time stops all of black's threats, as well as create new threats on my end as of knight f6 check. Also, the e6 pawn is pinned. If pawn captures on d5, then the rook on e8 is hanging, so black is in a pretty hopeless situation at this point. My opponent played queen a8, protecting the rook on e8 another time and renewing the threat of capturing my knight on d5. But now knight f6 comes with a check, therefore black doesn't have time to checkmate. King captures and knight captures the rook also with a check, in fact with a double check, therefore the king needs to move out of it. And here I just played f3, making sure no more checkmate comes around. And even after I lose my knight on e8, I still have an extra rook, and black only has 2 pawns in compensation for it, which is certainly not sufficient, and therefore my opponent resigned. What did we learn from this example? Well, a perfect example, don't leave pieces on unprotected squares. And let's see one more example from my own experience that I played in 1984. And what do we see in this position? Well, if you look at the material count, we see that there is an equal balance. I have a bishop versus knight, which theoretically can be a plus when there are pawns on both sides of the board. However, the black knight potentially could have a beautiful outpost on d5. And for example, if black would get to exchange queens and then position the knight on d5, black would be just fine. Black's problem right now is that white's pieces are very active and the black pieces, on the other hand, are discoordinated. The black queen is far away from the action, the black rook is not yet in the game, while the white queen, rook and bishop are ready to attack, or at least almost ready. Try to think and see what you would like to play here if you're white. And the correct answer is, somewhat surprisingly, the quiet and peaceful move h3. The purpose of the move is to open up a little window for the king to escape to avoid any back-rank checkmates. The reason why that's important is that now the white rook is freed up and is ready to go, ready to attack, avoiding the back-rank checkmate. At this point, black is pretty helpless against next the white rook appearing on e7, then the queen on g6, and then voila, checkmate. My opponent responded by playing rook e8, which stops that plan. The problem is it drops a piece. I captured rooks, followed by queen f8, winning the knight. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. This is an example on a famous motif that was invented a long time ago. Here, white to move, seemingly is in trouble, is down 2 pawns already, and the third one in danger. However, if you find the correct solution, you'll come up ahead, and in fact with a winning endgame. Good luck! And the answer is rook c8, rook captures, and now a queen sacrifice, beautiful, followed by under promotion, and as an end result, white is up a knight. And white wins 1 more pawn after f6, knight e8. Black cannot hang on to either the g7 or the f6 pawn. Will be lost. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful jewel of the week, as well the examples I shared from my own experience. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.